The marsh was alive, with a kind of silence that unnerved even the most seasoned soldier. It wasn't the silence of still air or calm woods, but something thicker, something that felt like it was listening back. Reeds swayed gently in the humid breeze, brushing against each other, with whispers too soft to make sense of. A dragonfly skimmed across the water's glossy surface, landing briefly before darting away as though startled by an invisible hand. The Union patrol moved cautiously, boots sinking into the mud with each step. Their uniforms, once crisp blue, were streaked with green smears and black stains from the swamp water that clung to everything it touched. Mosquitoes swarmed around their heads, buzzing relentlessly, but no man dared to swat. Each soldier's hands stayed glued to his rifle, eyes darting at the reeds and shadows around them. They were deep in enemy country, and every rustle in the grass could spell death. "Keep moving," barked Sergeant Callahan, a burly man with a beard thick enough to hide half his face. His voice carried authority, but beneath it there was the faint tremor of unease. He'd lost men in these marshes before, good men, shot down by hands they never saw. Eyes sharp. "He's out here, somewhere." The soldiers obeyed, though their pace slowed with each step forward. The marsh was a place that swallowed confidence whole. What seemed open and clear one moment became a maze the next, reeds closing in like a curtain. The water was waist-deep in some spots, knee-deep in others, and each man dreaded stepping into a sinkhole. Even the terrain seemed eager to claim them. Private Hensley, the youngest of the group, was the first to break the uneasy silence. "Sergeant," he whispered, his voice barely louder than the insects. "What if he's already gone? Maybe we're chasing ghosts out here." Callahan didn't turn. He kept his eyes forward, scanning. "Ghosts don't drop 3 men in one morning, boy. He's here. And until I see a body, you'll keep your mouth shut and your eyes open." The men exchanged quick glances, but no one dared argue. The sniper they hunted wasn't just another rebel soldier. Word had spread quickly through the ranks about a Confederate marksman who used the marsh as his hunting ground. He knew the waterways, the reeds, the shadows, and he struck without warning. Bullets came from nowhere, men fell, and by the time anyone fired back, the marsh had already swallowed him whole. The soldiers fanned out slightly, rifles raised, trying to cover more ground without drifting too far apart. The reeds hissed softly in the wind, but every so often there was another sound, a splash, a ripple, a shift of weight on wet earth. Each time their hearts jumped, fingers tightening on triggers. But each time it was nothing. "Think he's watching us right now?" muttered Corporal Dawson, his voice low. He was tall and wiry, his uniform hanging loose on his frame. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the grip on his rifle. "Course he is," Callahan said flatly. "Men like him don't run. They wait. They pick their moment." That thought sank deep into the soldiers' minds. Somewhere, hidden in the tangle of reeds and shadows, a pair of eyes could be staring at them even now, steady and unblinking. Somewhere, a finger might already be resting lightly on a trigger. The marsh seemed to tighten around them, each step forward a march deeper into an unseen trap. The patrol reached a stretch where the water rose to their thighs, and the reeds grew so thick they had to push them aside with their rifle barrels. Every movement made noise, the slap of water, the rustle of stalks, and each sound felt like a betrayal. Private Hensley couldn't stand it anymore. "This is madness," he whispered. "We're walking right into his sights." Before Callahan could snap back, another soldier, Private Lewis, a broad-shouldered man with a scar down his cheek, turned sharply, scanning the reeds. He had heard something, a faint shift of weight, a subtle splash, the kind of sound that didn't belong to frogs or birds. His pulse quickened. "You hear that?" Lewis whispered. The patrol froze. Every man stood still, breath caught in his throat. The marsh fell into a tense quiet. The buzzing of insects seemed to fade. Even the reeds stilled, as though the swamp itself were holding its breath. Then crack! A rifle shot split the air. The sound echoed through the marsh, sharp and final. Private Dawson let out a strangled cry and collapsed into the water, clutching his chest. Blood blossomed on his uniform, spreading quickly as the swamp water swallowed him. The soldiers shouted, splashing for cover, rifles raised. Down, down! Callahan roared. He dove into the muck, pulling Hensley down with him. Bullets hissed overhead, the reeds trembling where they cut through. The sniper was out there, close and invisible. The marsh erupted with chaos. Some soldiers fired blindly into the reeds, the crack of their rifles answering the unseen enemy. Others pressed flat into the mud, trying to make themselves as small a target as possible. Smoke began to rise from the discharged shots, clinging thickly in the damp air, turning the swamp into a haze of gray and green. Callahan's mind raced. He knew firing wildly was useless. The sniper would have already moved after his shot, slipping deeper into the marsh's cover. But the men needed something in the action to keep them from breaking apart completely. Hold the line, Callahan bellowed. Keep your heads low. He can't take us all at once. But in their hearts, each soldier knew he didn't need to take them all. Just one by one, patient as the swamp itself. Private Hensley pressed himself into the mud, shaking. He could still see Dawson's face in his mind, the shock in his eyes as he went down. The boy's knuckles were white around his rifle, though he hadn't fired a single shot. Somewhere in the reeds, the sniper waited, watching, breathing. Callahan raised his eyes, scanning the marsh. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw movement, a ripple across the water, a shadow shifting where no wind blew. He lifted his rifle, sighting down the barrel, but when he blinked, it was gone. The marsh mocked them with its silence. Then, from the reeds, a voice carried faintly. Cold, calm, deliberate. You'll never leave here. The words struck the men harder than bullets. It wasn't a shout, but a promise. The sniper was close, so close he could speak to them, toy with them, make them feel like prey. The soldiers' faces paled, and for the first time, Callahan felt doubt gnawing at his own iron resolve. The marsh wasn't just hiding the enemy. It was feeding him, making him stronger, more like a phantom than a man. And with every step forward, the Union patrol was marching deeper into his world. The swamp closed around them like a tightening fist. Every step forward pressed the men deeper into its grip. Waist-high reeds rattled against their uniforms, and black water sucked at their boots. The smell was thick rot, stagnant moss, and the faint metallic tang of blood that lingered from the skirmish only minutes earlier. Sergeant Callahan forced the men forward. His voice was low, gruff, but firm, as though he could push back their fear with tone alone. Keep moving. Don't falter now. He's one man. We're 10. But the number didn't comfort them. 10 had once been 13. Dawson was gone. And the sniper's reputation was such that it didn't feel like man against man. It felt like man against something unseen, something the swamp itself had birthed. The men spread in a half-circle, rifles raised. Their eyes twitched at shadows, following every ripple that disturbed the water. Some swore they saw movement in the reeds, but when they fired, the only thing that fell was startled birds, wings flapping in panic before vanishing overhead. Private Hensley's voice trembled. Sergeant, he's picking us apart. It's what he does. We can't see him, we can't catch him. This swamp belongs to him. Callahan's jaw tightened. He turned just enough to glare at the boy. Then we'll take it from him. Step by step, bullet by bullet, But even Callahan felt the gnawing weight of unease. He had hunted men before. Bandits, rebels, deserters. But always men he could see. Men who ran and fought back in clear lines. This was different. Here, the air itself felt like it carried the sniper's breath, the reeds his hands, the water his eyes. Corporal Dawson's death replayed in his head. The way the man had dropped instantly, shot clean through the heart. That wasn't wild luck. That was calculation, the work of a marksman who waited for the exact moment of exposure. Whoever was out there wasn't simply shooting. He was studying them, testing them, breaking them. The patrol reached a narrow channel where the water deepened into a slow-moving stream. They had to wade through, rifles held above their heads to keep the barrels dry. The current tugged at their legs, sluggish but insistent, and more than one soldier stumbled as the mud beneath gave way. "Eyes up," Callahan hissed. "Don't give him the chance." The men lifted their heads, but every direction looked the same, reeds swaying gently, trees leaning heavy with moss, shadows moving when the wind shifted. The swamp was a hall of mirrors, every corner the same, every sound deceptive. Then came a splash. Not the sound of a frog or turtle, but heavy, deliberate, close. "Left flank," shouted Lewis, spinning, rifle raised. Half the men turned with him, barrels pointed at the reed wall. Their fingers itched on the triggers. But when the stalks parted, nothing emerged. Just water rippling outward in slow circles. "Hold your fire," Callahan barked. "He wants you jumpy." The words settled uncomfortably. It was true. Every sound, every movement, it was all part of a cruel game. The sniper was pulling them deeper, making them waste their strength, their nerves, their ammunition. Private Hensley whispered, "Feels like he's right on top of us." And he was right. Hidden not 50 yards away, Elias Turner lay in the muck, his body half submerged in water, so cold it numbed his skin. His rifle rested steady across a mound of moss, wrapped in rags to keep it dry. His breathing was slow, controlled. He had been here long before the soldiers pushed in, watching, listening, waiting. He saw their fear as clearly as their blue coats, saw the tremble in their hands, the hesitation in their steps. He could hear the mutters under their breath, the way their voices cracked with strain. To him, they weren't hunters. They were quarry, walking blind into the Marsh's throat. His finger brushed the trigger, but he didn't fire. Not yet. He was patient. He had learned patience in these swamps as a boy, stalking deer with his father. You didn't shoot at the first chance. You waited for the right one, the one that mattered. The soldiers waded through the stream, splashing and cursing under their breath. Callahan pushed them onward, but their formation faltered. The swamp demanded constant attention, mud sucking at their boots, reeds clawing their arms, leeches clinging unseen beneath the water. Each man fought not only an enemy, but the ground itself. "Sergeant," Lewis said after they crossed, his voice low, "he could pick us off any time. He wants us tired, wants us angry." Callahan glanced at him. "And when he shows himself, we'll be ready." But the sergeant wasn't sure. Deep down, he wondered if they would ever see the man before the next bullet struck. The patrol pressed onward, but the air itself seemed thicker. The swamp grew darker, trees arching overhead, blotting out the sky. Every sound was amplified, the slap of water, the rasp of breath, the groan of wet leather. Then a voice broke through, calm, mocking, so close it froze the men in place. "You don't belong here." The soldiers spun, rifles raised, hearts hammering. The voice had no clear direction. It echoed, bouncing across the reeds and water, as if the swamp itself had spoken. Hensley's breath came in ragged gasps. "God help us. He's playing with us." A shot cracked. The bullet slammed into Private Lewis's leg, spinning him into the water with a scream. Blood poured into the swamp, mixing black with red. The soldiers fired wildly, muzzles flashing, smoke choking the air. Reeds snapped, water erupted, but there was no sign of the shooter. "Get him up!" Callahan roared, hauling Lewis by the collar. The man groaned, clutching his leg, pain twisting his face. Another shot rang out, splintering a tree inches from Hensley's head. The boy screamed and dropped flat into the muck. "He's close! He's close!" shouted one soldier, firing into the reeds. But Elias had already moved. Sliding silently through the water, he shifted his position, vanishing like a shadow melting into the swamp. The smoke, the confusion, the chaos, it was all cover for him. By the time the soldiers steadied themselves, he would be elsewhere, ready again. The patrol huddled together, backs to each other, eyes darting wildly. Callahan's jaw clenched. He had seen ambushes before, but nothing like this. This wasn't war, it was a hunt. And they weren't the hunters. The swamp fell silent again, the echoes of gunfire fading into stillness. Hensley whispered, "Sergeant, what if we don't make it out?" Callahan didn't answer, because for the first time since he entered the marsh, he wasn't sure. And somewhere in the reeds, Elias smiled grimly, knowing the fear was working. He didn't need to kill them all today. He only needed to remind them that in this place, the swamp chose who lived and who died. Elias Turner had not moved for hours. His body was half submerged in the cold marsh water, the surface broken only by the rise of his rifle across a mound of moss. Mosquitoes landed on his face, stinging his skin, but he didn't flinch. Mud clung to his cheeks and hair, masking his scent and blending his outline with the reeds. He looked less like a man and more like some creature born of the swamp. The Union soldiers' shouts carried faintly across the water, their boots splashing, their curses echoing. He knew their voices well, their anger, their bravado, their fear. He had been listening for hours. Patience was survival. That was the first lesson the swamp taught. His father had drilled it into him long before this war ever came. Elias had grown up on a small farm in Georgia, a patch of land wrestled from stubborn soil. His father, Thomas Turner, was a quiet, stern man who believed the earth gave nothing freely. "Work, Elias," he used to say. "That's how you earn your life." Work and patience. From his mother, Elias inherited a softer side. She read aloud by candlelight in the evenings, filling the small cabin with words that painted pictures brighter than the oil lamp's glow. She taught him to listen to the rhythm of stories, to the voices of people, to the sounds of nature that told truths words could not. As a boy, Elias often wandered into the marshes at the edge of their farm. There he learned silence. He learned to watch the deer that came at dawn, the heron stepping carefully through the shallows, the way wind changed the reeds. His father taught him to hunt, placing an old rifle in his hands before he was tall enough to hold it steady. "Don't chase," Thomas would whisper. "Wait, let the land give the moment to you." Elias never forgot. When war came, he hadn't wanted it. Like so many others, it arrived at his doorstep uninvited, in the form of recruiters with polished boots and fiery speeches. His older brother Samuel had volunteered eagerly, swept up in talk of honor and duty. Elias had lingered, hesitant, but eventually followed. The farm couldn't shield him forever. The first months of war were confusion and noise lines of men, endless drilling, smoke, and cannon thunder. Elias felt lost in the crowd, a farmer's son thrown into something larger than he could grasp. But in battle, when the muskets fired and chaos reigned, he found his place. His rifle spoke for him. He had the eye. He could steady his hands when others trembled. He could wait when others rushed. By the time his brother Samuel fell at Antietam, Elias was already known as a marksman. They pulled him from the line and gave him a scope, told him his job was to make every shot count. He accepted silently. But when he returned home on leave, his mother's eyes lingered on him as though she saw a shadow that hadn't been there before. "You don't smile anymore, Elias," she had said. "I ain't got the reason to," he'd answered. Now crouched in the reeds, he thought often of those words. The swamp had become his home, his cover, his graveyard. It was the one place he could still control the terms of survival. He didn't fight in grand charges or stand shoulder to shoulder in bright uniforms. He fought alone, one shot at a time, blending into the land as though he belonged to it. The Union soldiers cursed somewhere beyond the reeds, their boots sloshing louder now. They were close. Elias pressed his cheek gently against the worn stock of his rifle, the wood smoothed by years of his hands. Through the scope, he saw flashes of blue uniforms moving between the reeds. Their faces were tight, eyes wide. He could feel their nerves like a pulse in the air. But he didn't fire. Not yet. Patience. Always patience. He adjusted slightly, shifting his weight to ease the cramp in his leg. The mud sucked at him, cold and relentless. His shoulder ached from the shot he'd fired earlier, the recoil jarring against a bruise that never seemed to fade. He ignored it. Pain was just another noise to silence. A dragonfly landed on the barrel of his rifle, its wings shimmering green in the light. For a moment, Elias stared at it, remembering childhood days when he would chase such creatures with his little brother by the riverbank. Samuel's laugh had carried so easily then. It struck Elias like a blade, how clear that memory was even now, how distant it felt, as though it belonged to another life. The dragonfly lifted off, and his eyes returned to the scope. Through the lens, he saw one of the soldiers, just a boy, really kneeling in the reeds, hands shaking on his rifle. Elias could see the fear in his eyes, the way his lips moved in a silent prayer. The shot was easy, too easy. But Elias hesitated. He could almost see himself in that boy, thrown into something too big, too cruel. For a heartbeat, he lowered the rifle, fighting the weight of both mercy and duty. Then he remembered Samuel, lying on the battlefield, his blood dark in the dirt. He remembered his mother's tears. And he remembered Callahan's voice, the same tone he'd heard in other Union sergeants, hard, commanding, treating Southern lives as fodder for a cause Elias never believed in. His jaw tightened. He lifted the rifle again. The swamp around him fell away. Time narrowed to the circle of glass, the crosshairs, the rhythm of his breath. He exhaled slowly, letting the world still. The boy in blue raised his head, exposing the soft line of his neck. Elias's finger curled on the trigger. But just before the shot, he stopped again. Something inside him resisted. He pulled back, lifting his cheek from the stock. He let the boy slip away, unaware of how close death had come. "Not yet," Elias whispered to himself. "Not you." He shifted his sights further down the line. Callahan moved through the reeds, barking orders, trying to keep his men steady. That was the one Elias wanted. Not the boy. The leader. Break the head, and the body falters. He settled back into silence, waiting for the perfect moment. The sun dipped lower, bleeding gold into the swamp. Shadows grew longer, stretching across the water. The Union patrol edged deeper, their nerves fraying with every step. Elias tracked them, patient as ever, his mind split between the now and the past, between the farmer's son he had been, and the sniper the war had made him. For hours he would wait, hidden in the reeds, body still as stone, mind sharpened to a razor's edge. This was his world now. And when the moment came, when the sergeant stepped into the open and lifted his head just so, Elias would strike not as a man, but as the swamp's phantom hand. Because in the marsh, patience always decided who lived and who died. The swamp pressed in heavier as dusk thickened, as though the land itself was conspiring to bury everything inside it. The air was damp and heavy, clinging to skin and lungs alike. A dull ache lingered in Elias Turner's bones, the kind that came not only from crouching for hours in the mud, but from weeks of sleepless nights, endless hunts, and the strain of knowing every day could be his last. He had learned to live with fear. It had become a constant companion, quiet but relentless, gnawing at him in the dark when the shooting stopped. It was there when he woke in the mud, when he cleaned his rifle, when he listened to the cries of the men he killed echo across the marsh. Fear reminded him he was alive, but it also threatened to undo him if he gave it too much space. Elias pressed a palm into the cold muck beside him, grounding himself. His father's voice came back to him again, words from another lifetime. Fear keeps a man sharp, son. Don't let it drive you, but don't ignore it neither. He drew in a slow breath, steadying himself. The Union soldiers were close. He could hear them now with absolute clarity, the scrape of boots against roots, the muted swish of rifles brushing reeds, the hissing whispers traded in anxious bursts. They were moving cautiously, like men who knew they were being watched. Their sergeant's voice cut through the murk, low and commanding. Elias recognized that tone, the voice of someone who knew fear too, but refused to let his men hear it. Keep steady. Callahan muttered somewhere beyond the reeds. He's waiting for us to falter. Don't give him the chance. Elias's lips twitched, though it wasn't a smile. The sergeant was right. But knowing the truth and surviving it were two different things. He shifted slightly in his hiding place, careful not to disturb the reeds that shielded him. The water lapped softly against his chest, sending a shiver through him. His body was weary, the muscles in his legs burning from holding still so long. He wanted nothing more than to stretch, to breathe deep without restraint. But movement was death. The swamp was unforgiving. Stillness was survival. And yet, in that stillness, the mind had room to wander. His thoughts drifted to his mother, her hands cracked from years of work, her eyes always carrying that deep sadness after Samuel's death. Would she even recognize Elias now if she saw him here, painted in mud and shadows? Would she see her son, or just another ghost the war had claimed? The ache of memory threatened to swell into despair, but Elias forced it down. This was not the place for weakness. He could mourn when the war was over, if he lived to see its end. For now, he had only his rifle, his patience, and the swamp. He adjusted his weapon, feeling its familiar weight steady him. The rifle was more than iron and wood now. It was his shield, his voice, his only companion in this desolate fight. Every shot he fired carried not only his skill, but his will to keep going. Elias exhaled, long and slow, calming his heartbeat. He whispered to himself, barely moving his lips, patience. Always patience. Still, the question gnawed at him. How long could he hold them back? There were too many. Even if he struck true again and again, numbers had a way of swallowing skill whole. His position was strong, but not invincible. If they rushed him, if they burned the reeds, if they simply refused to give up, he would be cornered. The thought sent a ripple of panic through him, sharp and cold. His breath hitched, and for a moment, the weight of inevitability crushed him. Capture meant more than humiliation. It meant being paraded as a killer, maybe worse. He had seen what Union soldiers did to men like him when they were caught. He closed his eyes tight, forcing the terror back. No, not yet. Not me. He remembered Samuel again, his brother's laughter, his reckless grin, his voice shouting above the roar of battle before it was silenced forever. Samuel hadn't hesitated. He'd rushed headlong into the fight, fearless. and he was dead. Elias had always been the opposite, careful, deliberate, methodical. That patience had kept him alive this long. But now, patience alone wouldn't be enough. Resolve hardened in him like steel cooling in a forge. If he was to fall, he would fall on his terms. He would not give them the satisfaction of dragging him out, bound and broken. He would fight until his last breath, until the swamp itself closed over him. His hand tightened on the rifle. He pictured the sergeant again, the leader's stance, the way his men looked to him for strength. If Elias could break that man, he might shatter the patrol's resolve. Fear would do the rest. He had seen it happen before. One shot, one death that mattered, and the enemy unraveled. The reeds shifted gently in the breeze, but Elias knew the difference between wind and men. The Union soldiers were near, creeping closer, unaware of just how close they were to the barrel of his rifle. He swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat cutting against the damp air. His finger brushed the trigger guard. He thought again of his father's lessons in the marsh, hunting deer. You can't control the animal, Elias. You control yourself. That's all. You control yourself, and you win. The boy in him, the farmer's son, felt the tremor of fear. But the man he had become, the marksman forged in war, held steady. He lifted the rifle, sighted down the barrel. Through the scope, he caught glimpses of blue, flashes of movement between reeds. He steadied his breath. The world narrowed again to the circle of glass, the crosshairs, the rhythm of air leaving his lungs. For a moment, everything was quiet. The swamp, the soldiers, his fear it all stilled. This was the edge where dread met decision, where a man either broke or stood firm. Elias Turner chose to stand. He whispered into the silence, as much a promise to himself as a warning to his enemy. "You'll not take me alive?" And with that, he pressed his cheek tight against the stock, waiting for the sergeant to step into his sights. Even the insects, constant companions in the muck, seemed to pause their buzzing. The only sound was the muffled splash of boots pushing carefully through the shallows. Every man in Sergeant Callahan's patrol moved with deliberate care, eyes scanning the reeds, rifles raised, fingers brushing nervously at triggers. They knew he was there. Elias Turner crouched low in the reeds, his body half swallowed by water, his face streaked with mud. He had become something in human more shadow than man, a figure molded by the swamp itself. His breath came slow and steady now, the rifle cradled against his shoulder, the barrel rising just above the marsh grass. Through the scope, he tracked them. 5 men, tired, anxious, bound together by duty, but splintering at the edges with fear. Callahan was at the front, his jaw set, eyes narrowed. The sergeant carried himself with authority, but Elias saw the strain in his shoulders, the stiffness in his movements. This was no fearless commander. This was a man pressing forward against his own better judgment, because retreat was worse. The Union men fanned out, reeds brushing against their uniforms. Elias could hear them now, whispering to one another. "Where is he?" "Keep your eyes open, he's here." "I swear it." "Feels like the devil's watching us." Callahan hushed them with a sharp gesture, then froze. Something a ripple, a glimmer of mud too thick, too still caught his attention. His hand shot up, signaling silence. The men obeyed, weapons rising, breath held. The swamp exhaled. And then, as if born from the muck itself, Elias rose. Slowly, deliberately, he stood from the water, reeds dripping off his shoulders, mud sliding down his face. His figure emerged like an apparition, his rifle leveled, his eyes hard and unyielding through the scope. For a moment, he seemed less a man and more a phantom, something conjured by the swamp to punish intruders. The Union soldiers gasped, some stumbling back, one swearing under his breath. Even Callahan's eyes widened, though he held his ground. "There!" one man shouted, his voice cracking. "Hold!" Callahan barked, but his own voice betrayed the tension knotting his throat. Elias said nothing. He let the silence stretch, the rifle steady in his hands, the crosshairs fixed squarely on Callahan's chest. His presence alone was enough to freeze them in place. The sergeant's hand twitched toward his weapon, but he knew better. The sniper's aim was unshakable. Any sudden move, and he would fall first. "You can't hold us off forever," Callahan called, voice echoing strangely through the marsh. "You're one man against 5. Drop the rifle and you might live." The words hung in the air, empty. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't lower his weapon. He simply stared, the barrel unyielding, his silence more powerful than any reply. The soldiers shifted nervously. One man raised his rifle higher, finger white on the trigger. Elias's scope swung to him in an instant. The soldier froze, his breath catching, his entire body stiff, as though he'd been turned to stone. Elias's calm unnerved them. He seemed untouchable, immovable, like a force of nature rather than flesh and blood. And in that silence, fear seeped deeper into their bones. Callahan tried again. "Listen to me. You're cornered." "You can't," the rifle cracked. The shot shattered the stillness, a thunderclap that echoed across the swamp. One Union soldier cried out, spinning backward into the water, his rifle flying from his hands. Blood spread quickly in the reeds, staining the swamp a deeper shade of red. The others shouted, stumbling for cover. Muck splashed, reeds bent and snapped. But Elias didn't run. He didn't scramble. He remained where he was, steady, rising above the water like a statue of vengeance. Through the scope, he found his next mark. Another soldier ducked, firing wildly into the reeds. The bullet hissed past Elias, close enough to send mud spraying across his face. He didn't blink. Another squeeze of the trigger, another sharp report. The man dropped, his shout cut off mid-breath. Panic spread like fire. "They're dropping us." "Fall back." "No." Callahan's voice cut through the chaos. His eyes locked with Elias's across the distance, each man measuring the other. The sergeant's men hesitated, torn between fear and obedience. But Callahan couldn't mask the truth. He was afraid too. Elias held his aim, the crosshairs steady on Callahan's chest. For a long moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the swamp holding its breath. The sergeant swallowed hard, his rifle aimed but wavering slightly. He tried to summon words, but none came. Elias's trigger finger tightened, then paused. For the first time, he spoke, his voice low but carrying across the marsh like a verdict. "You should have stayed out of here." The sound of his voice was enough to unnerve them further. They had expected a beast, a silent killer. Instead, they found a man, one who had chosen the swamp as his battleground, one who was willing to become a ghost to survive. The standoff balanced on a razor's edge. One wrong move, one slip of a finger, and it would all be over. Callahan's men crouched in terror, their nerves fraying, while Elias stood tall in the reeds, his resolve carved from every loss, every memory, every drop of fear he had conquered. The swamp waited, silent witness to the fragile line between life and death. And then, a second shot split the air. The second shot cracked like thunder, splitting the humid air, and chaos erupted. Union soldiers dove for cover, their boots thrashing mud and reeds into a frenzy. Rifles fired wildly, the sharp reports overlapping in frantic bursts. Bullets hissed through the marsh, splintering reeds, striking water, snapping branches overhead. The swamp, which had been eerily silent moments before, now roared with violence. Elias Turner remained where he stood, rifle steady, heart hammering in rhythm with each squeeze of the trigger. He had learned long ago that panic was the true killer. The men before him were trained, armed, but fear ruled them now. Their shots went wide, blind attempts to silence a phantom. He picked them off methodically. One man splashed forward, trying to flank him through the reeds. Elias's scope tracked his desperate movement, the way his shoulders hunched low, his face pale with terror. A single breath, a measured squeeze crack. The soldier tumbled forward, his rifle sinking into the mire before he did. The others shouted, their voices breaking. "He's on us! Can't see him, God help us!" Callahan barked orders, voice raw from straining. "Hold your ground. Spread out, pin him down." But even he ducked lower now, crouched behind a half-submerged log, mud streaking his uniform. Authority meant little when death whispered from the reeds. Elias shifted position, sinking back into the water. He moved like the swamp itself, silent, deliberate, almost invisible. The water closed over his shoulders as he crawled a few yards to the left. Vanishing from the sight lines, the Union soldiers desperately fired into. Their bullets struck only water, spraying harmless ripples. When Elias rose again, he was already aimed at another target. A soldier huddled behind cattails, trembling, his hands shaking too hard to reload. Through the scope, Elias could see the man's lips moving, murmuring some half-formed prayer. Elias hesitated, just for a breath. He saw Samuel in that man's frightened eyes, saw the same youth that war had stolen too soon. But hesitation was a luxury he couldn't afford. With grim resolve, he squeezed the trigger. The soldier slumped sideways, his prayer silenced mid-word. The swamp stank now of gunpowder and blood. Smoke drifted low across the water, clinging to the reeds like mist. The cries of men mixed with the croak of frogs, and the distant caw of crows startled into flight. Nature and violence became indistinguishable. Callahan cursed, firing into the reeds with controlled bursts. He wasn't like the others. His aim was steady, his shots purposeful. But Elias was no fool. The sergeant was dangerous, not because of his rifle, but because of his will. He still held his men together, if barely. If Elias wanted to survive, Callahan had to fall. Through the shifting smoke, Elias found him. The sergeant crouched low, jaw clenched, eyes scanning desperately for the sniper's glint. Mud streaked his face, but his hands were steady as he reloaded. He was a man cornered, but not broken. Elias inhaled, centering himself. His crosshairs hovered over the sergeant's chest. One shot could end it, scatter the survivors, dissolve their fragile unity into retreat. But just as Elias steadied, a rifle roared to his right. Bark exploded inches from his head, shards slicing his cheek. He jerked back, instinct pulling him lower. Pain flared hot where the splinters struck, but he gritted his teeth, ignoring it. The swamp water was red now, though he didn't know how much was his blood or theirs. "Got him pinned," a Union soldier shouted. Another voice answered, "Push forward now." Their fear had turned to desperation, and desperation could be just as deadly. They surged, two men advancing through the reeds, firing in bursts, trying to corner him. Elias crawled backward, then pivoted sharply. He knew this swamp better than they did. Every clump of reeds, every log, every pocket of deeper water was a weapon in his hands. He slid along a submerged ridge, rose just enough to sight, and fired. One of the advancing men dropped instantly, his shot cutting off mid-flash. The other faltered, his courage shattering as he stumbled backward into the muck, firing wildly with trembling hands. Elias tracked him, but before he could fire, Callahan's voice boomed. "Fall back. Regroup." The surviving soldier obeyed, scrambling toward the sergeant's cover. Elias didn't fire. Not yet. He let them retreat, let them huddle together in the mire. Their numbers dwindled, their resolve bleeding out like they're wounded. He sank lower again, his breath ragged. Exhaustion tugged at him, his arms ached, his chest burned, his mind swam with the weight of every shot fired. He had held them back, but for how long? His body screamed for rest, but rest was death. The sergeant's voice carried again, steadier this time, defiant. He's bleeding. I saw it, he's hit. He's not invincible. Elias touched his cheek, his fingers coming away sticky with blood. The cut burned, but it was shallow. Still, Callahan's words mattered less for truth than for hope. And hope was enough to keep men fighting. Through the reeds, Elias caught sight of the sergeant's eyes again. Callahan glared across the swamp, face grim, body taut with resolve. They were two men trapped in the same snare hunter and hunted, yet both unwilling to yield. The standoff had broken into chaos, but the battle was far from over. The swamp was littered with bodies now, the water thick with the dead. Elias's chest heaved as he forced another cartridge into the chamber, mud caking his hands. His vision swam with fatigue, but he steeled himself. He wasn't finished. He wouldn't be finished until the swamp swallowed him whole or until the last man fell. The swamp went silent again. Not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating hush that follows violence, the kind that weighs on men's shoulders and presses in their ears. Gunpowder hung thick in the air, a bitter fog that burned the throat. The smoke clung low to the reeds, swirling around bodies half submerged in mud. The water was dark with blood, ripples spreading lazily across the surface, as though even the swamp had grown weary of motion. Elias Turner slumped lower in the mire, his breath ragged, chest heaving with every inhale. The fire in his cheek stung, but worse was the burning pain in his side. Sometime during the frenzy a stray shot, a splinter, he couldn't tell something had torn into him. He pressed his palm against it, feeling the warmth of blood seeping through his fingers. Not mortal. Not yet. He swallowed hard, forcing the pain into the back of his mind. His father's words came back to him. Pain is proof you're still living. Use it, and he clung to them like a rope. He had no choice but to endure. Through half-lidded eyes, Elias scanned the swamp. Bodies floated motionless, their blue coats darkened by mud and water. One soldier lay draped across a log, his rifle still clutched in stiffening hands. Another stared skyward, eyes wide and glassy, his prayer unfinished. The frogs had begun croaking again, tentative at first, as though the creatures themselves questioned whether the danger had passed. But Elias knew better. Across the reeds, Sergeant Callahan crouched with two survivors. Their faces were pale, their eyes wild, their hands trembling as they reloaded rifles they no longer believed would matter. Callahan's own face was streaked with mud and blood, but his jaw was set like stone. His gaze swept the swamp, searching for movement, searching for the phantom that had torn his patrol apart. Elias met his eyes, just for a breath, before sinking lower into the reeds. He couldn't fight anymore, not like before. His side throbbed, his limbs heavy. But he could vanish. That was enough. He had learned long ago that victory wasn't always killing the last man standing. Sometimes it was surviving when no one expected you to. He slid backward, slow, careful, letting the water swallow his body inch by inch. Every movement sent a fresh wave of pain through him, but he gritted his teeth and endured. The reeds closed over him like a curtain, mud sucking at his boots, water lapping gently against his chest. He became part of the swamp again, unseen, untouchable. Callahan's voice carried faintly through the mist. Eyes sharp. He's not gone. Not yet. But there was a quiver in it now, an edge of exhaustion. His men didn't answer. One stared blankly at the water, as if trying to comprehend how it had all unraveled so quickly. The other muttered curses under his breath, his hands shaking too hard to steady his rifle. They were alive but broken. Elias reached a deeper pocket of water and let himself sink to his chin, the coolness numbing the fire in his side. His breath came shallow, careful not to ripple the surface. The swamp wrapped him in its damp embrace, hiding him as it always had. He thought of Samuel again, his brother's reckless grin, his laughter before battle, his death. For years, Elias had wondered what made Samuel charge so fearlessly, what drove him to embrace death instead of resisting it. But crouched here, bleeding into the swamp, Elias understood something different. Survival was not cowardice. It was defiance. Every day he lived, he defied the war that had taken everything from him. A crow caught overhead, startling the Union men. One fired instinctively, the shot cracking uselessly into the branches. Elias almost smiled, though the effort hurt. Fear had consumed them completely. They no longer fought him. They fought shadows, ghosts, the swamp itself. He pressed harder against his wound, feeling the seep of blood slowing under his hand. He had to move, had to disappear before Callahan gathered his courage again. If the sergeant pushed forward, even weakened Elias couldn't hold. But Callahan didn't move. He stayed rooted behind his log, torn between vengeance and survival. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The swamp hummed again with its usual life, the buzzing of insects, the distant croak of frogs, the splash of unseen creatures in the shallows. Nature resumed, indifferent to the dead men who now fed it. At last, Callahan's voice broke the silence. "Fall back. We're done here." One of his men stared at him in disbelief. "But what if we fall back?" Callahan snapped, his voice raw. "This swamp has swallowed enough of us. Let it keep him." The men hesitated, but obedience won over fear. Slowly, they began retreating, dragging themselves through the muck, eyes darting nervously at every ripple. Callahan lingered a moment longer, scanning the reeds one last time. His gaze swept across Elias's hiding place, lingering just long enough to feel like recognition. Then, with a muttered curse, he turned and followed his men. Elias remained still long after they were gone. He listened to the sound of their retreat, the splash of boots fading into distance, until only the swamp remained. Then, and only then, did he let out a long, ragged breath. He pushed himself deeper into the reeds, away from the battlefield, his body trembling with exhaustion. Each movement sent fire through his side, but he endured. He had endured before. He would endure again. Behind him, the swamp claimed the dead. Reeds bent over them, water closed around them, and the fog thickened until even their shapes blurred from memory. By dawn, it would be as though nothing had happened at all, just another secret the swamp chose to keep. Elias disappeared into the marsh, leaving no trail, no sound, only ripples that faded into stillness. By the time the sun broke the horizon, he was gone, swallowed whole by the land that had become his only ally. To the survivors, he would remain a phantom. To the swamp, he was merely another shadow moving through its depths. And to history, he became something else entirely, neither man nor myth, but the whisper of a sniper who rose from the marsh, fought like a ghost, and vanished back into silence. The swamp returned to its natural rhythm, as though the firefight had been a nightmare that dissolved with the first light of dawn. The reeds swayed gently, water lapping against fallen logs. Birds cawed in the distance, and frogs croaked in measured rhythm. The battle's echo had faded, leaving only the memory of men who had fought and the ghost who had vanished. Elias Turner moved slowly through the deeper reaches of the marsh, every step careful, every breath shallow. The pain in his side throbbed with each movement, but he pressed forward. Survival demanded it. The swamp had saved him once. It would have to do so again. He paused in a small clearing where the water was shallow and the mud thick. A carnage of the previous night lingered in his mind. The blue coats, the faces frozen in fear, the screams and gunfire. He carried them all as ghosts within him. Every death etched into his memory, but Elias forced himself onward. He had no time to mourn, no time to look back. The swamp claimed the past, but he had to navigate the present. Whispers of a phantom. By midday, Callahan and the remaining survivors had reached the outer edges of the marsh. Their numbers were depleted, their morale shattered. Rumors began even before they emerged from the reeds. He was everywhere at once. One soldier whispered, shaking uncontrollably. "I swear." He moved like the swamp itself. Callahan remained silent, staring at the distance, the memory of Elias's unblinking eyes and steady aim burning into his mind. He had faced many enemies, men of skill and will, but never like this, never a single man who seemed woven into the very land, as if born from the reeds and mud. By the time word spread among the other units stationed nearby, Elias Turner had taken on a life of myth. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones about the phantom of the swamp, a sniper who could appear and vanish at will, who struck without warning and left no trace. Some claimed to have seen him on moonlit nights, a shadow among the reeds. Others swore they heard the snap of a twig or the faint click of a rifle that didn't exist. Parents warned their children not to wander near the marsh, telling stories of the ghostly marksmen who haunted its depths. Elias Turner, once a boy from a Georgia farm, had become legend. A soldier's reflection. In the quiet that followed, Elias found himself crouched by a slow-moving tributary. Blood still stained his side, but the rush of adrenaline had dulled the pain. He looked down at the water, seeing his reflection fragmented by ripples. The face staring back was not the same as the one that had entered the swamp weeks ago. Eyes sunken, lips tight, expression hardened by loss and survival. The boy who had once roamed the fields of Georgia, who had laughed with Samuel and listened to his mother's stories by candlelight, was gone. What remained was a man forged by war, by patience, by the marsh itself. He knew he could not return, home not truly. Even if he walked the fields again, they would feel alien. He had changed. The war had marked him. The swamp had taught him lessons that no classroom or camp could provide. Death and survival were constants, and he had learned that life was not about glory, but persistence. The unseen legacy weeks passed, and the story of the swamp phantom grew. Union soldiers spoke of the sniper in fearful reverence. Confederate scouts whispered of the man who vanished as suddenly as he appeared. Each retelling added to his legend, embellishing his skill, his cunning, his near-mythical ability to disappear. Yet no one knew the truth. Elias never sought recognition, never claimed victory. To him, survival was enough. He moved silently through the marsh, living off the land, using the swamp's secrets to remain hidden. Every ripple in the water, every rustle of reeds, was a reminder that the land itself was his ally. Sometimes, at night, he would find a quiet spot in the deepest parts of the swamp, sit against a tree, and let the world drift away. He thought of Samuel, of his mother, of a life he could never reclaim. And in those moments, Elias understood that the swamp had not only saved him, it had reshaped him, made him into something more than a man, something feared and respected in equal measure. A story without end. Locals still tell the story. Children dare each other to venture near the swamp, only to return pale and silent, claiming they saw a shadow among the reeds. Soldiers stationed nearby warn new recruits to never underestimate the swamp, never assume it is empty. Elias Turner's story exists in fragments, in whispers, in the tremor of fear in a soldier's hand, in the fleeting sense that something watches from the marsh's edge. He is everywhere and nowhere, a shadow, a legend, a ghost. And in the quiet of the swamp, where only reeds and water speak, Elias moves unseen, alive, and ever patient. The war may end, armies may retreat, but the swamp keeps its secrets. And some ghosts are never meant to be caught. Elias Turner vanished into history the way he had vanished into the reeds, silent, deadly, unforgettable. The swamp remained, and it waited.